You're listening to Cultivation Elevated, hosted by Michael Williamson, where we discuss vertical farming and the future of cannabis and food production.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome back to Cultivation Elevated, the podcast from PIP Horticulture, where we explore the people, technology, and the ideas shaping the future of cannabis and controlled environment agriculture. Over the past week, cannabis rescheduling has dominated the headlines. Depending on who you listen to, this is either a massive turning point for the industry or just more noise out of Washington. What's getting lost is what this actually means for licensed operators, craft cultivators, MSOs, hemp businesses, pharmaceutical companies, investors, and capital. Rescheduling is not legalization. It doesn't magically fix banking. It doesn't automatically open interstate commerce, but it does change the chessboard in meaningful ways. Today, even with a lot of unknowns still on the table, we're going to do our best to cut through the hype and talk into the legal reality. Before we go any further, I do have to give you a quick disclaimer. This episode is for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing discussed today should be considered tax, legal, or investment advice. All opinions expressed are those of the individual speakers and do not represent the views of their respective firms, employers, or clients. Laws and regulations vary by jurisdiction and are subject to change, so listeners should consult their own qualified legal and professional advisors before making any decisions. All right, so joining me today is Devin Baxter, founder of Baxter Law, and a cannabis-focused attorney who worked directly with license holders across the country. Devin started her legal career in Washington, D.C., working on complex regulatory and litigation matters, and later shifted into cannabis and regulatory law in the state of Florida. Today, she advises on operators on licensing, compliance, and navigating some of the more nuanced regulatory issues in this space. Devin, I really appreciate you joining me, especially last minute during a busy holiday week.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here and to talk about a really exciting topic. It's created a lot of buzz in the cannabis space.
Yeah, it definitely did. So before we get into like secondary and third order effects, I think it's important to ground this conversation. So there's a lot of confusion right now between rescheduling, descheduling, and legalization, and those differences matter in practice. So I guess let's start with, what does cannabis rescheduling actually change immediately, and what does it not change at all?
Yeah, I definitely think there's some misunderstanding about this because on Thursday I got a bunch of congratulation texts saying like, oh, cannabis is legal, not from people in the industry, but just like friends that know I practice in the space. So what changed between Thursday of last week and Friday or the day after is essentially nothing. The executive order did not change the current law regarding cannabis. What it says is it's a directive to the Attorney General to finalize a rulemaking process that will move cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. And I assume that most people listening to this podcast are familiar with the CSA and how drugs are classified, but briefly, the Federal Controlled Substances Act, that's a federal law regarding drugs, places substances into 5 different categories based on whether there is an acceptable medical use for the drug as compared to how dangerous the drug is or whether there's potential for abuse. So for quite a while, cannabis has been in Schedule 1, which is like the scariest, baddest category. And this executive order has directed the rulemaking process to continue to move it down into Schedule 3. And to give some context, other drugs in Schedule 1 are like hallucinogens, LSD, things like heroin, I think is a Schedule 1. Schedule 3 is like testosterone, ketamine, things that do have an accepted medical use and can be prescribed by doctors. It does not affect immediately state programs, right? The tension between federal law and state law will still exist. So many states have adult use now. I'm in Florida. Florida has a medical use program. Those programs will still be kind of in the gray area. And it doesn't legalize marijuana. Legal marijuana would mean anyone could grow it, anyone could possess it. It would be regulated like alcohol. Anyone could purchase it. That's not what we're discussing here. We're discussing a rescheduling, not a legalization of marijuana.
Nice. A lot of people frame rescheduling as a political movement, but what really forced the issue was science and manufacturing. So, on one side, you had a serious clinical research finally producing FDA compliant human data showing that cannabis actually works as a medicine. And then on the other side, you had countries overseas proving that cannabis can be grown or manufactured under full pharmaceutical standards that are consistent and repeatable and auditable. Once those two things existed, the government's old Schedule 1 argument stopped holding up, and rescheduling wasn't really a victory lap. It was regulators realizing they couldn't defend the old position anymore. And so I learned a lot this past week about Kessler Camp. And so they really, in Kessler Camp, it's not a group, it's really talking about a legal strategy. Can you talk a little bit about that and why the goal was to force the FDA and the DA to justify Schedule 1 with real evidence, especially around medical use and safety?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question that's to be answered when you're discussing rescheduling of a drug. And listen, I think it's long been anecdotally known that there are medicinal benefits to marijuana, right? We've had state legal medical marijuana programs for quite a while now. We've had anecdotal evidence from people that have used marijuana as an alternative to pain medicines, or for other conditions. But there's always been a barrier to research because of the federal illegality of cannabis. That's an important benefit to rescheduling. And as more research has been conducted, as more data has been compiled, there's been increasing evidence that there are medical benefits to cannabis that have been hard to ignore. And there have been FDA approved cannabis derived drugs in the past. I know Epidiolex for childhood seizures is one of those. So as we've seen the development of those, it's harder and harder to ignore the benefits. And for critics of marijuana or people that have been hesitant to, that are still holding on to the reefer madness mindset of marijuana, when you start to talk to a friend or a family member, or you read an article about the benefits of marijuana, there's been a shift. I think that both the research has improved that, and just anecdotally, and as state programs have expanded and people have seen benefits.
Nice. I guess shifting gears a little bit, a lot of the operators immediately jump to taxes, specifically 280E. And there's a narrative forming that this is a clean switch that instantly improves margins. Historically, tax transitions involved, controlled substances are rarely that simple. I have a couple clients on the West Coast that I saw, they put out some investor communications that were very lofty in what they think is around the
Like, we're rich
corner.
now. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I know that, it's been a struggle these last few years for everybody. And so they're kind of just, you know, surviving for a lot of folks has been thriving in the cannabis space for the last few years. And so they're really, trying to grasp at any straw they can. But how clean is the 280E transition in practice, and what are the gray areas that still exist for operators?
Yeah, so 280E has always been a significant obstacle to state operators. So 280E is the provision in the federal tax code that prohibits cannabis plant touching companies from deducting normal business and operating expenses. So a regular business, like my law firm, right? I have my revenues. If I buy printer paper, if I pay rent, if I pay staff salaries, I get to subtract that from my gross, and I'm taxed on the net. Cannabis companies, by large measure, haven't been able to do that. So as a result, they've paid effective tax payments that are much higher, effective tax rates that are much higher than what a different type of normal business would pay. And I've read, that there are some cannabis companies that pay effective tax rates of 75%, 80%, which is crushing to businesses. That makes it, you really rely on raising capital and things like that to grow your business. There have been some tax strategies employed by cannabis companies. Many companies separate plant touching parts of their business from
Mhm.
other revenue streams. They might do cost of goods sold calculations a little bit differently than other businesses would do. So how clean is it going to be? There's definitely going to be a transition period, right? If you're one of those companies that has set up this structure based on 280E, you might want to revisit that. You're going to need to think about your go forward plan post 280E removal. What is that going to look like for your cash flows? How are you going to manage it? Investor relations. Now, it is exciting to say, like, okay, this is a huge tax benefit. But now our investor is going to have this crazy high expectation of what your, post 280E finances are going to look like. How can you manage those expectations appropriately? And if you're a company that maybe hasn't been tracking and recording ordinary business expenses because there wasn't an incentive to, are you going to have to put controls in place to make sure that you are tracking those expenses properly? So there's definitely going to be some work involved in the transition. And I would say for most operators, thinking about that and planning for that should start today.
Makes good sense. Another headline we keep seeing is banking, and there is this expectation and reality that are often very misaligned. Even with rescheduling, financial institutions still answer to a web of federal regulators and not just the DEA. So, why doesn't rescheduling automatically solve banking access, and what legal barriers still remain for financial institutions?
Yeah. So post rescheduling, state marijuana programs, they're still going to be operating in a gray area. They're still going to be operating technically in violation of federal law. So the big banks that are federally chartered are subject to anti-money laundering provisions, right? They can't bank drug dealers, essentially. That's where it came
Sure.
from.
Yep.
And that, that isn't going to change with rescheduling because the state programs are still going to be in that gray area. So when we talk about big banks, big national banks, or even US based stock exchanges like the New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, I don't think rescheduling is going to bring them into the fold with cannabis just yet. That being said, we do see state-based banks, credit unions here in Florida. There are a handful of Florida-based banks that do bank our cannabis companies. I think we could see an increase there in comfort in that space, maybe increased competition in that space.
Sure.
Hopefully brings down some of the fees because I know my clients for those accounts pay exorbitant fees. And another issue with banking is just access to traditional bank loans. Cannabis companies don't have that. If you or I have, again, I'll use my law firm example, if my printer breaks down and I can't afford a new printer in cash, I can run to my bank, I can get a bank loan, buy the printer, and can continue operating. Cannabis doesn't have that access to easy capital from the big banks. Hopefully, we see more private capital emboldened to enter the space, and for those, the credit unions and state banks, that they extend some more of those options to cannabis operators under rescheduling. That would be my hope.
Yeah, that would be nice.
Yeah.
So, for operators on the ground, this isn't just a legal conversation. It touches compliance structures, corporate entities, contracts, and even SOPs that were built under the Schedule 1 assumptions. For licensed operators listening right now, what compliance or structural issues should they be reviewing immediately?
Yeah. So, number one, I would say tax planning, how you keep your financial records, getting with your financial professionals, make that strategy. So, that's number one. Number two is I think that we need to prepare for perhaps increased scrutiny of the industry, right? I don't think that the FDA and the DEA are immediately going to descend on state operators, but I think that there will be increased presence in looking at state operations. Federal agencies that maybe just haven't wanted to even touch it or ask questions may start asking questions. Or even if you're an operator that's hoping to attract a new investor or a new banking partner or something like that, I think you have to expect that they're going to take a close, hard look at your SOPs. How well are you running your operation? I think they're going to look at your good manufacturing practices to see like how clean is your processing facility? How safe are your products? How are you labeling your products? Are you making some crazy unsupported health claims on there? How consistent is your product formulation and your potency? All of those things, I think, are going to increase in importance as there are more eyes on the cannabis industry.
It's one of those areas where, as you know, I work across multiple states and countries, and I worked extensively in Canada pre-COVID, and the Canadians had to follow all GMP specs. It was a huge difference from how operators handle in the states, but even from state to state. I mean, if you go West Coast to East Coast, it's a pretty big difference in compliance and operations. I would say Nevada is probably one of the stricter states. I only know of a handful, a very small handful of people that built out for this future concept of like being DEA ready. A lot of people are pretty behind on that. So I know there's time to transition, but these are things that take a lot of time. And so it's kind of like, knowing that there's a North Star that inevitably kind of leads the same way. People need to kind of get busy now.
Yeah, and I also think it's a change in mindset for some operators. Some operators are already in that mindset and have been from day one, but some haven't been. And that requires kind of regrouping and getting all your employees on board with, okay, yeah, we know we've kind of had these SOPs and loosely followed them.
Mhm.
Now we're really going to be ramping up the importance of that. So can be a change in culture, a change in mindset for some operators.
Definitely. Well, on that note, too, not all operators are positioned the same. So, multi state operators, single state licenses, and craft operators all face different risk profiles and opportunities under Schedule 3. So, I guess from your perspective, how does rescheduling affect MSOs differently than like a single state or craft operator?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone is going to benefit from the 280E change, right? The influx in capital. Hopeful, I guess I shouldn't be so out. Hopeful influx in
Sure.
capital, following that. I think MSOs have a lot more resources to deploy often to kind of take advantage of this time. Craft operators might have to be a little bit more bootstrappy to see how they take advantage of it. But I definitely think there is a market and a place for everyone. There's an opportunity to develop brand loyalty with consumers, to expand in your niche. And with MSOs, there's an opportunity for them to expand their footprint to be even larger. So I think there's an opportunity for both. There's a lot of speculation about our big pharmaceutical companies going to now get involved in this space. And I think that will be interesting to follow. I guess my guess is that there's probably more of an opportunity for partnerships to be explored between those type of companies with MSOs that are already growing and producing products on a large scale. But that's just my speculation.
Sure. Well, and you highlighted it. Whenever regulation shifts, capital starts to move. So historically, that's when consolidation typically accelerates. We've seen this in other highly regulated industries, and I don't think that cannabis is going to be an exception. Do you expect rescheduling to accelerate consolidation? And if so, where do you see pressures building first?
I think we'll go in ebbs and flows. I mean, cannabis, in some ways, it's a lot like other industries, but in some ways, it's special. There's a little bit of a rogue streak in cannabis
Sure, sure.
where people really value, I think, a scrappy, independent operator that has, a long history in the business, even if they're not the biggest. So I don't ever see a complete monolith consolidation of the cannabis industry for that reason. I guess I think back to like the craft beer market in the
Mhm.
early 2000s where, you saw these craft beers explode and it was super exciting. And then we saw some get bought up by big companies, some open and some close. It's kind of an ebb and a flow. There'll certainly be some consolidation, but I think there will always be room for an excitement about supporting craft operators.
Yeah, I'm aligned with that analogy.
Yeah.
One of the concerns that I have is while operators are focused on upside because they've been kind of beaten down the last few years, enforcement risk doesn't disappear. And in some cases, it may become more targeted and more sophisticated. So, what enforcement or regulatory risk do you think operators are underestimating right now?
Lab testing and health stuff. In Florida, in most markets, we are required to use a state certified lab to test our final products before they go to the market. But I think we've all seen headlines across different states about, not all of those labs are good players or producing reliable testing results. Maybe they're fudging potency, maybe they're not sampling properly. I think that's something that is really underestimated, and there's a tension there, right? If you're an operator with very narrow margins, it really stinks to have a batch fail and have to be destroyed, or to have a potency number on your batch that's lower than what your competitor has, and you feel like you're losing out on the competition. But quality lab testing, I think, can't be understated, particularly as we're saying there's going to be more eyes on the industry. And we're talking about more players entering and more investment. But I think we might also see more patients enter the market. Here in Florida, we're a medical market, we grow week over week. You have to get a card from a doctor to purchase from a medical marijuana dispensary. But as we see a shift in federal policy, I couldn't imagine that maybe some people who were hesitant to go to their doctor and get that card may now go for it. So you might be serving more patients that have a compromised immune system. You might be serving someone's grandma who is trying an edible for the first time, and she needs to know that every time she takes this edible, it's going to be 3 milligrams of THC. You don't want to surprise her one time and, there's a homogeneity problem and now it's 13 milligrams. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of selecting a quality lab partner and really working with them to hone and develop your SOPs and your health and safety policies and protocols.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, there's a term called lab shopping where they'll just go shop out the best lab that'll give them the biggest test scores, right? And 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 the response that I hear is like, I'm just playing by the same rules as everyone else. Why would
Right.
I go to a lab that they may be more accurate, but this one's maybe more inflated potentially? And then, at the end of the day, it's typically point testing. And so, how much of that sample of the entire batch is being representative? And in some states, the lab comes and picks the product out of the batch. And then in other states, you get to send it off, which means you get to cherry pick, if you will. And once people kind of learn moisture content or water activity or how dry or wet the product is, you can manipulate test scores because it's being diluted by water essentially. So there's all kinds of tricks, of course, that the cannabis guys have learned over the years to try and optimize what they have and try and survive in some of these markets. And it is unfortunate that high THC is pretty consistently driving most markets. And it doesn't always translate to a more medicinal product in some cases, or in some cases, a misleading product.
Yeah, and in
Um,
Florida, we have a challenging climate here, right? It's very humid, it's very buggy. So I worry a lot about, about that, about the use of pesticides, which very few are allowed here in Florida, but still, it can happen under the radar if you're not a cognizant operator. So I think it's really going to be important to guard for those kind of abuses.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so let's zoom out for a minute to adjacent markets because this obviously doesn't happen in a vacuum. The hemp market, which I operated in 10 years ago and got to, be boots on the ground for, and it seemed very exciting in Colorado. We went from growing in indoor buildings that were relatively small in comparison to doing, 5 acre, 50 acre, 500 acre plots. And I got to watch this whole thing kind of explode. But it's operated in a legal gray area for years. And about 10 years ago, we saw MSOs make an aggressive push into the CBD and hemp market. At that time, it looked like a smart diversification, but the market quickly became oversaturated, margins collapsed, and many of those early ventures failed to create lasting value. But if we fast forward to today, the dynamic feels very different. Over the past year plus, we've seen MSOs and national consumer brands have started to re enter the hemp market and the CBD space, especially in the drink space. largely because it offers a path to national scale that traditional cannabis still doesn't. There's also growing speculation around hemp-derived cannabinoids potentially being covered by Medicare, which would be a huge shift. So at the same time, you have these asset-heavy cannabis operations who often see hemp as an unfair playing field. Intoxicating hemp products face far fewer regulations, yet compete directly with state license in cannabis and have taken real market share from the cannabis operation. So, from a legal perspective, are we heading towards a true convergence between hemp and cannabis? And do you expect medium and large MSOs to re-enter the hemp sector as that regulatory gap starts to close potentially?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So as part of the kind of budget bill that was passed, there was a provision in that bill that would essentially eliminate the legality of most intoxicating hemp products on a federal level, set to go into effect in November of 2026. So that was before this executive order. So we're potentially on track for an elimination of most intoxicating hemp products. And depending on who you talk to, you know more about cultivation than I do. So I understand that that would even have, based on the limits of the THC in that law change, that it would potentially make it very difficult, if not impossible, to grow a CBD whole flower product that is low enough in THC to be federally legal. So, open question, is that going to go into an effect in the next year, or is there going to be a legislative fix for that or a change? There's a lot of speculation around that. And then this recent executive order, it directed Congress to update the statutory definition of final hemp-derived products. And it said to allow Americans to benefit from access to full spectrum CBD products. So I think that's understood to basically say, hey, we still need to be able to grow a whole flower CBD product. It shouldn't be so restrictive that we remove that product from the market. And yes, there's been some talk about even allowing for Medicaid reimbursement for CBD based products. So the answer to the question is, I don't know. I don't know what will happen in this next year. I think it's going to be hotly debated. I think there's going to be lobbyists on both sides of the issue. And it will be interesting to see. I certainly think we will see a significant reduction in intoxicating or hemp derived products. Will they be completely eliminated? I don't know. But even here in the state of Florida in the past year, we've seen quite a significant, they revised the regulations so that they can't be child appealing anymore. We've seen quite a few enforcement actions, removing products from stores, destroying products, and in some cases, even criminal enforcement for, gas station hemp derived
Sure.
THCA flower that ended up testing higher than the limits. So it's certainly an open question about what's going to happen there in the future.
So my background pre-cannabis was in neurology, and I worked for a very large pharmaceutical company that I don't like to say out loud anymore these days.
Yeah.
And I told my wife, I said, I started as a consultant for, X pharmaceutical company, and I said this 10 years ago, but I was like, I'll probably end my career as a consultant for X pharmaceutical company. Schedule 3 puts cannabis squarely in a category where pharmaceutical companies already operate comfortably. That starts to raise questions about competition and standards and regulatory expectations. Does Schedule 3 position open the door for pharmaceutical companies? And what does that mean for traditional plant touching operators?
Yes. I mean, I think that door has already been partially opened, right? We talk about Epidiolex, or there are some products already on the market that pharmaceutical companies have invested in and developed. I've read some studies, I don't know how reliable they are, but I read some studies that said, hey, in states with a state legal medical marijuana program, pharmaceutical companies see about a 10% reduction in the use of pain medications, which I think is pretty interesting if it's true, but that certainly cuts into their profit margin, right? And as that number creeps up, I think we'd be naive to think that pharmaceutical companies will not try to capitalize on opportunities in the cannabis market. That being said, historically, pharmaceutical companies focus on products that they can patent and that they can control.
Formulary consistency.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't see big pharmaceutical companies just selling like whole flower products
Or
or
a vape
pre-rolls.
pen. Yeah.
No, no. Are they going to develop more nasal sprays or capsules or things like that? I could see that happening. But also, my understanding of the FDA approval process is it's a lengthy process to get those drugs tested and approved, and pharmaceutical companies are going to want to be sure that they do that and are, cognizant of any liabilities associated with the products. I'm sure that they're certainly going to be investing into research, and we're going to see more money going into research and research grants and things, which is interesting. But in the short term, I don't see pharmaceutical companies posing threats to cannabis operators. Is there going to be some tension there? Sure. But I don't think it's going to be an immediate play to jump in and replace.
No, they can't move that fast from my experience. And they have a cultural uphill battle.
Yeah.
And, at the end of the day, to your point, some of this stuff has already existed and it hasn't, really deterred the market that much.
Yeah.
All right. So, kind of as we kind of round it out, I want to talk a little about strategy, capital, and a little bit about the road ahead. So, one of the biggest long term questions is interstate commerce. Rescheduling does not authorize it outright, but it may shift the legal arguments around it. Does rescheduling strengthen or weaken the legal argument for interstate commerce?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I think that we could potentially see some more legal challenges, kind of testing the limits of, if there are more grounds to challenge prohibitions to interstate commerce. But, currently, as it currently stands, unless we're talking about an FDA approved drug, interstate commerce is going to be prohibited. Yeah, it will be interesting to see. I'm not sure, but what I am sure of is that there will be more legal challenges, more people trying to push those limits. The outcome to be decided, I would say.
Sure. I will say the cannabis operators, especially those West Coast guys, they are very good at pushing the
Yeah.
limits there and their interpretation of said law. Um, okay.
Yeah,
So,
and I think there are some states, I think on the West Coast, right? I think there are a few states that have already said, hey, if it becomes federally legal, we already want to do interstate commerce over here. So it'll be interesting.
yeah, I always struggled with that because I'm like, you create so many jobs within the state. Like I would imagine that the reciprocating state has to approve it coming through. And, if you've already have infrastructure and tax revenue and all this job creation, it seems to me personally that it could really hinder what's been built and maybe negatively impact the states in a way and, drive that revenue somewhere else, which I don't see. I think if you follow the money, I don't know why a state would want to get on board with something like that, but I'm sure there's something I'm missing. Um, all right, so operators have relied heavily on state protection for years, but federal involvement changes the balance between state authorities and federal preemption. How should operators think about state protections versus federal preemption in a post rescheduling environment?
Yeah. So states will still be able to make marijuana illegal in the state, right? There's still going to be the possibility of more restrictive laws in a state. I mean, I think about intoxicating hemp, right? Which up till now has been legal on a federal level. Well, post Farm Bill has been legal on a federal level, but there have been quite a few states that have enacted like Delta 8 bans and things like that. We could see that, right? So even rescheduling to Schedule 3 for those states that are more conservative about marijuana, that doesn't necessarily mean that the states have to follow suit. Some will, right? A lot of states do have their own Controlled Substances Act that tracks the federal act, but they can certainly have controlled substances regulations that are more restrictive on the federal level. So, yeah, that's a possibility.
Very cool. All right. So to wrap this into something actionable, I wanted to ground this in a strategy. And I've gotten to work with you personally on a couple projects. And so I've always really appreciated your advice. But if you were to advise a well-capitalized operator or an MSO today, what are three strategic moves you would prioritize over the next 12 to 24 months?
Getting the good cultivation sites, right? Thinking about a cultivation site that has sufficient access to water and to power. Those are not unlimited. I mean, varies by state to state, but in Florida, particularly if you want to be in a certain geographic region in Florida, those sites are getting bought up, right? There's only so many places where you can get the sufficient power hookup. So that's something that I would think of right off of the bat. Your financial planning would be number two, your tax strategy. How are you going to capitalize on this excitement and the changes in the rescheduling to reinvigorate your business, reinvigorate your investors, and then also to manage their expectations and to leverage this change to grow your business and improve your business. And then I think just tightening up on your compliance program and preparing for increased eyes on your program, whether it be from regulators, whether it be from new potential partners, new potential investors, or new potential, patients or users of your product. I think we have to expect that there are just going to be more eyes on the industry. So making sure that you have your compliance program in place, that you're doing those GMP processes, and that you are being the best, most responsible producer of these products that you can be.
Nice. So to wrap this up, some of the big takeaways for me is that rescheduling is neither a silver bullet nor a nothing burger. It's a meaningful shift, but one that rewards disciplined operators and punishes assumptions. So Schedule 3 may unlock tax relief and improve capital conversations, but it doesn't erase federal and state conflicts. It does not guarantee banking access, and it does not eliminate enforcement risks. The operators who win in the next phase, as you said, will be the ones that stay compliant, structure intelligently, and plan for second and third order effects instead of chasing headlines. So, Devin, I want to thank you very much for bringing clarity to a very noisy moment for us in the industry. And if you found this episode helpful, share it with someone who's still trying to figure out what cannabis rescheduling really means. And as always, our goal here is to provide practical operator level insight. Thank you very much for listening to Cultivation Elevated.